Welcome to Accessibility Now. I'm your host, Matt Shedd. Accessibility Now is a podcast produced by the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. Jordan Hall is the mobility coordinator for the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. She has personally encountered obstacles to mobility and transportation as a person who uses a motor wheelchair. She discusses with us her path to her position as the mobility coordinator at SILCGA and how being hired was an introduction to the resources provided by the Centers for Independent Living. She also explains why sharing her experience and listening to the experiences of others with disabilities have been some of her greatest assets in fostering change. To close, she shares with us the biggest obstacle that she is trying to address in terms of mobility for Georgians with disabilities.
So my name is Jordan Hall. I am the Mobility Policy Coordinator for the SILC, and this has actually been my 6th year, which feels crazy that I have been with them for this long. But when I think about mobility, I don't just think about transportation. Transportation is definitely the biggest piece, but I really think about the walkability of the sidewalks and infrastructure as well, and just any mode of traveling that an individual with a disability might use.
Gotcha. Okay, well, that's a good segue. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey to getting into this role and what kind of got you invested in doing this work?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think number one, for the listeners that don't know this, I live with a disability myself. So I have spastic diplegia, cerebral palsy. And so I have been a power wheelchair user for the past 15 years. And I'll just be very transparent so that any of our listeners that are going through similar things can understand. I went to college and I got my undergraduate degree, but I had worked all through school. Like I did paid internships, then had jobs. And so I was really, really fortunate to have those opportunities in school. So my original plan was always to go to law school. But so I thought, let me get my feet wet and get some business experience just to make sure this is what I really want to do. And I would go in for interviews, and like I'd already had the phone interview. And as most of our listeners know, and if they don't, I want them to know that you don't have to disclose your disability. So, what I would typically do is I would do the phone interview, and then if they said, oh, we really like you, like we think you're the ideal candidate, we want you to come in for an in-person interview. That's when I would say, like, just to let you know, like, I am a wheelchair user. So there's certain needs that I have in terms of entrance to the building. Is there a ramp? Is there an elevator? And that kind of gave me an idea of what their perception was going to be. But before the SILC, they were actually my 69th job interview. I would go in for job interviews, and if the people did not know that I was in a chair, they would literally ask me, are you sure you're the same person we spoke with on the phone? Is this really your resume? And as the audience can hear from my voice, I have a very particular brand of pick. So I'm like, my voice is not that different. And so, to be quite honest with you, one of my friends who we're still friends to this day, but she volunteered at the Youth Advocacy Center, which is directly across the street from the SILC. And she saw our assistant director, Becky, rolling out of the office. And she said, hey, one of my best friends is also in a wheelchair and she's been trying to get a job. How did you get your job? And so Becky immediately called me and referred me to Disability Link. And so I was going through the process with them, but then Becky reached out within the same day and she said, we looked at your resume and we are actually hiring for a mobility coordinator. And then if you think you would be interested, we would love to interview you. And so before I went in, I had no idea what the Silk office was or what centers for independent living were. But so in preparation for the interview, I went and I looked up the mission and the vision and the services that were offered. And I was like, how have I lived with a disability this long? And I didn't know about the sales. And so I met Shelly and Becky, and it was just really, really encouraging because I knew they were a force to be reckoned with. I could just tell in the way that they presented themselves and in the way that the questions were being asked. But not only that, I knew that they saw me. Like they saw me for what I had to offer, not the package that I come with, which is the chair. And so once I started the role and I learned about what SILs do, and even Shelly, like in my personal life, like I knew nothing growing up about the resources that are available to individuals. The schools and things, they don't tell you anything. So my parents were my primary caregivers from the time I was 8 until I was 18. And it was only then that I started learning about Medicaid waivers. But through working with Shelly, she's actually the one who even got me introduced to the Medicaid waiver ICWP. So not only did working there inspire me because I knew that we were going to be helping people within our community, but my resources expanded exponentially just through working there. And so that's what I want to do. I mean, I feel like my life changed so drastically when I found independence in my interdependence. And that's just really what I feel like the SILs provide to their consumers and what we as SILC, when we're advocating for policies for people, get to provide too.
What a wonderful story and great introduction that you had to this powerful organization and the Statewide Independent Living Council, and then the network, the Georgia network of independent living centers, the SILs. Um, and I just really appreciate that context. And it kind of leads me to my next question, which I'm curious to know what you knew about mobility and transportation and these issues just as a person living with a disability versus what you have learned in the past 6 years.
Well, for me, I grew up in a very rural area. I grew up in McDonough, Georgia. So, for example, in McDonough, there's only one existing transit entity that will cover the entire county, and it's very limited, and that's Henry County Transit. So literally for majority of my travel throughout my lifespan, because this is another thing, I don't have the physical capability to drive. I don't have depth perception, so that just wouldn't be safe for me. I was able to get evaluated at Shepherd's Spinal Clinic, and it was determined that that was just not the safest option. So for me, that meant a variety of things. Number one was that I was going to have to rely on public transit. And if I didn't rely on public transit because the services were so limited, my parents would literally have to break down my power wheelchair into pieces. I used to have a power chair that you take the battery off and you can lay it on its side. And so my parents had to do that for me. That was mainly the way that my transit functioned because Henry County Transit, the one service available, would only be from like 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. It was a very limited schedule. So mobility for me was basically me relying on my able-bodied caregivers to do all the heavy lifting to get to and from. So that kind of, as soon as she said mobility, I was like, oh, that's so needed because in the rural areas, that is typically the case. There will only be one transit provider, and even if the transit provider is available, the hours are very limited, and a lot of times they don't cross county lines. Like it's a very specified area for travel, which does not allow access to a lot of community activities.
Wow, yeah. So is that where a lot of your work has been since you've started in this position? I know it's been a while that you've been in this position, but has it been focusing primarily in rural areas like where you grew up?
Definitely have tried repeatedly to place an emphasis on rural areas and to get as included in the rural areas as possible. But the thing is, it's kind of very similar. It's the same thing when we're talking about these rural areas. They currently only have one or maybe two existing transit entities. So when I'm approaching this, I approach it as like whatever policy I'm trying to get implemented. Like for example, I'm working on a project with the Atlanta Regional Commission. But part of the reason that I work on these projects within the region is so that if a project is successful and provides more service, and they can say, look, we've done this number increase in riders, this number of people is using the service. The goal is to be able to use that as an example to give to the county commissioners in the rural areas to expand transit.
I see. Okay.
So, but I am a part of GDOT's, the Georgia Department of Transportation. They have something called a Rural Human Services Transportation Plan, and I am one of the stakeholders for that. So that plan is specific just toward the rural communities and not towards the urban. So I'm able to provide direct feedback to those rural human services transit plans as well.
I gotcha. So, what do you think for you, kind of now being a little bit on both sides of this, first as a citizen trying to get around, and now kind of seeing a little bit more, a lot more behind the curtain of how all this stuff gets decided and done? What have been some of the eye-opening things for you that you've learned?
For me, the thing that I've learned, and this is something that I'm taking with me, is that you have to make your disability experience relatable to these policymakers. You know, that's one of the things that why I think transit is so important. A lot of times, people that are within the able body community can sometimes feel intimidated asking questions, I think. And so I think for me, it's really been about connecting with those policymakers on a personal level to say, hey, I'm here. This is my daily life. This is what it looks like. I have a job that I need to go to. Not only do I have a job, because when we're talking about transit, people typically talk about the bare necessities, like non-emergency medical transportation to and from doctor's appointments. But for me, transit is the building block for community access and economic growth. So if I'm going to travel somewhere, I don't just want to know that I have access to my medical appointment. I want to be able to go to places of worship. I want to be able to go to restaurants, to go shopping, to do everyday activities that everyone else would do. And I would just say that a lot of times people, when they hear a term, like a diagnosis is a big word, cerebral palsy is a big word, right? If you were to Google cerebral palsy right now, it would come up with a wide array of scenarios of what the person's lived experience is like. Majority of the time, if people do the Google searches, they will see the worst case scenario first. And then that's their picture of what living with a disability is like. And that is so not the case for so many of us. And so I think it's about exposing people, getting our wheels in the door, showing them, hey, I have this diagnosis that on paper looks like this, but in actuality, this is what my life looks like. And I find that sharing that personal experience really makes it real for them, and it encourages them to really want to fight to have a more inclusive and accessible community.
Well, so that's really well put, and have you? It sounds like you've seen some success using that tactic.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think just even in like the opportunities that I have been afforded to be a part of, there is an organization called the National Aging and Disability Transportation Network, and they offer several grants and like ways to figure out, the lacks in accessible transit within the community. And so when they were doing this grant, they only selected like 6 host sites, and it's a national organization. So they're looking at all 50 states, and they actually asked the SILCGA to be one of the host sites. So from there, we went and spotlighted one of the centers, and it was really important to me to spotlight a center that was in the rural area, because the rural areas are where there's the most discrepancy. And so Augusta, our Center for Independent Living, Walton Options, was actually a focus group that was featured in NADTC's findings on needs for improvement for accessibility. So that was a really big highlight for me. And then also, I was fortunate enough, ironically, I was a fellow for AARP's walking college, which is very funny because I'm like, I'm not walking, but I'm rolling. And so one of the things that I did for my final project was to do a walking audit with different agencies throughout the state to demonstrate the lack of walkability of the infrastructure. So I was able to give them a full picture of what it is like to travel using a mobility device. And they were actually they sent it to the local municipalities as well. So that really opened eyes too. Um, and really, I try to get myself a seat at any transit table that'll have me. I try to make sure that when I'm there, I'm representing, and this is also important too, not just wheelchair users, but all types of disabilities. Our center, like in Savannah, I remember my first month on the job. I said, okay, I'm going to go to all the SILs, give them a presentation so that I can introduce them to me and see where they're at. And that I sent every center a PowerPoint presentation for the to introduce myself. And then I go into life, and I'm not exaggerating, 98% of the people had visual impairments. And I was like,
Wow.
okay, guys, I was like, I'm just going to be as honest with you as possible. I had no idea. And I came in with the PowerPoint presentation, and we are going to nix this. Like, I'm not even going to pull up the presentation. And I was able to say to them, I don't live as a person with a visual impairment. So I have no idea what your travel experience is like. Can you, it doesn't matter how minute it may seem, can you take me through journeys of what it's like for you traveling? And please just know that I'm not trying to be ignorant, but just be open with me, because that's the only way I'm going to learn is from your lived experience. And when I tell you, those people were so open with me, it it has stuck with me like the entire time I've been doing this job. When I'm in meetings and I'm evaluating the accessibility of a project or of a system, I can honestly think of needs for visual impairment sooner than I can needs for wheelchair users, because it was just so prominent. It made it come alive. I got the full picture of what their experiences are like. And in that case, one of the issues that they stated that they have is that they don't know that a bus is arriving unless they hear the sound of the engine. And so my response was, they don't call you, they don't let you know. And the answer was sometimes, but not really. So as soon as I left that meeting, I immediately called Chatham County Transit and other county transit systems. And I said, okay, I just went to a center and they're telling me that they are not getting calls when their ride is coming. Do you know that if an individual is blind, they need to be notified? And so the person on the line was able to tell me, yes, it should all be noted. So then I went back to the SIL. I got permission, because we never want to violate HIPAA. Like, we would never violate a consumer's privacy without their permission. But they were able to give me their names and their addresses and their contact information. And I was able to go one by one with that county authority and get it documented so that they would no longer have to wait for the sound of the bus. It would be in the system that they were to be notified and like called or even approached at the door. So it's like things like that have been things that have stuck with me like throughout this entire journey.
That was such a great. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
No.
That was such a great journey, or that was such a great story to really give us an example of the tangible work that you do, in terms of a, like you said, understanding what obstacles people with disabilities are facing, and then B, the advocacy that you're able to provide for those people. And I'm wondering now, for my last question, if you would mind sharing with us what are some of the front items on, or what are some of the items on the top of your to-do list in terms of important issues surrounding mobility, transportation that need to be addressed? Like, what's kind of at the forefront of your mind right now?
The forefront of my mind will always be true in the expanding transit, getting transit to expand beyond what's already existing. And this, I'm really glad that you said this, because like my main goal recently has been just to make sure that the Centers for Independent Living have access to a plethora of resources at their disposal. So I have made a directory of what is called metropolitan planning organizations. Almost every county within the state has one, and the MPO is the entity that gets most of the federal funding for projects. So they get most of the funding from the federal government for grants, including grants for transit. And so I have disseminated the directory of MPOs to the SILs in the hope every year the MPO opens what's called a tip solicitation, where they ask for proposals for expanding projects or projects that communities would be interested in. So I've provided that information to the SILs because I really want all of them to at least submit to the solicitation, because that gives them access to the metropolitan planning organizations, and they'll be able to get a seat at the table and create more of a dialogue. The other organization that I mentioned, NABTC, they are offering, I believe it's up to $30,000 per site for grants. So I've sent that to the SILs as well. And I've also partnered with some organizations that are really doing new innovative things within the transit system. For me, I would like for the state to transition to more of a micro transit model, because with a micro transit model, the individual would be able to book their trip in real time, versus like with paratransit, you have to book at minimum a day in advance, sometimes 3 days in advance. So I really want to get away from that and get to more of a micro transit model. So we have been partnering with organizations like On the Go, Passio Technologies, and some other entities that are just really changing the game in terms of micro transit and learning. Because see, this is the thing, I don't want the SEALs to have to come up with a plan. I want them to be able to work with organizations that already have the model, and through collaborating with these entities, they're then able to go to their MPOs and say, look, this is an organization that has done this model. This is an example of what's working. This is what it would cost to get something like this in our area, and to go from there, just really to expand.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the way I can tell you've been thinking about this a long time because of the way that you're not putting it on the sills to reinvent the wheel. The structures are already in place for the momentum to move a lot quicker than that, and to not burden them with that extra work. So yeah, I just really appreciate you laying that out. you're a really impressive person, Jordan, and I've really enjoyed getting to hear more about your job. We've interacted several times, but I haven't really sat down and heard about what you do. Is there anything else that came to your mind throughout the course of your conversation that you want to make sure that you mention?
I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the greatest way to facilitate change is to have an open mind with our conversations. And I say this as a person that lives with the disability myself. I know when we're trying to explain the barriers that we face, it can at times feel frustrating if we feel like we're not understood. But I would just encourage you and say this: the reason that I have such a clear picture of what it is like for individuals with visual impairments is because when I did come in with a PowerPoint presentation, don't forget that, like, clearly I didn't know what in the world I was doing. I was way off base. But because I wasn't met with hostility, I was met with openness and just a willing to create a safe space and to share in the experience. I got more from that. I mean, that was 6 years ago, and I still remember it so clearly. So I would just say to my disability community, you deserve to be seen. And one of the best ways to make yourself seen is just to be receptive to questions. Because for people to get to know us and what we experience on a daily basis, they have to ask questions. Be open to that. Welcome that. Because I'm telling you, if you are, it will stick with people.
Wonderful. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you again so much, Jordan. This has been really educational and just a really enjoyable experience for me.
Me too, Matt. You're my favorite interviewer ever.
That's very kind of you. I'll take that compliment and remember it. So thank you again. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Okay.
All right, that's it for this episode of Accessibility Now. I'm Matt Shedd. Accessibility Now is a podcast produced by the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. And as we sign off, we just want to say, a Georgia that includes all of us is better for everyone.